There are people in Scotland today carrying DNA scientists say should not exist here, not shouldn't exist in the past, shouldn't exist now. Hunter-gatherers from the Ice Age, skin dark as midnight, eyes blue as Arctic ice, their genetic code still pulsing through Scottish veins 12,000 years later when it vanished everywhere else. A Bronze Age apocalypse that erased 90% of Britain's male bloodlines, yet fragments survived in hidden glens and islands. Viking DNA more concentrated in Orkney than in Norway itself. And genetic markers from Saharan desert nomads showing up in the Highlands on islands where it rains 200 days a year at the edge of the world. The Picts carve symbols we still cannot read, their language extinct, their culture erased. But their blood we can decode. And it tells a story that violates every model of human migration we've built. This isn't about genealogy websites. This is about scientific paradoxes carved into human chromosomes. Genetic riddles that shouldn't exist according to everything we know about population dynamics and evolutionary pressure. Scotland isn't just a country. It's a genetic crime scene, and the evidence doesn't add up. 12,000 years ago, the last ice age releases its grip on Britain. Miles-thick ice sheets retreat northward, and into this newly thawed landscape come the first pioneers, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the first humans to walk Scotland in thousands of years. When scientists sequenced Cheddar Man, a 10,000-year-old skeleton from southwest England, they expected pale skin and light hair. What they got was shocking. Dark skin, tightly curled hair, and eyes the color of a frozen lake. This was standard across Western Europe after the Ice Age. These people looked nothing like modern Europeans. Here's what keeps geneticists awake. In most of Europe, this Mesolithic ancestry vanished, diluted by farmer migrations from the Middle East, Bronze Age warriors from the steppes, and thousands of years of genetic mixing. But not in Scotland. Studies in Science Journal reveal modern Scots still carry between 5 and 10% of this ancient Ice Age DNA. In isolated island communities, it's even higher. Genetic signatures from people who hunted with stone-tipped spears are still detectable in bloodlines today. It's like finding a living dinosaur in your backyard, a genetic fossil that refused to fossilize. Why Scotland? Why did this fragile, ancient ancestry fossilize in these glens and islands while it was erased from the rest of the continent? The answer lies in one of the most violent events in human prehistory. 4,500 years ago, Britain experienced a genetic apocalypse. They came from Central Europe, a people we call the Beaker culture, named after their distinctive bell-shaped pottery. They brought bronze tools, advanced farming techniques, and new religious practices. But they brought something else, something darker that doesn't show up in the archaeological record. They brought replacement. Here's the data, and it's chilling. Genomic studies published in Nature reveal that within just a few centuries of the Beaker people's arrival, approximately 90% of Britain's male DNA lineages were replaced. Not integrated, not assimilated, replaced. Think about what that statistic means. Entire Y chromosome haplogroups, genetic lines passed from father to son for thousands of years, just gone, erased from the human record as if they'd never existed. It's one of the most complete population turnovers ever documented in human history. More thorough than the Mongol invasions, more total than the European conquest of the Americas. The Beaker signature, particularly the Y haplogroup R1BL21, now dominates Scotland. If you're a Scottish man, there's an overwhelming statistical probability that your direct paternal line traces back to these Bronze Age invaders. But here's the paradox that geneticists cannot explain. Despite this apocalyptic replacement event, despite 90% of male lineages being wiped out, older haplogroups survived. In the Highlands, in the Hebrides, in Shetland, in isolated glens where geography became a fortress against genetic extinction. That same Ice Age DNA that should have been obliterated in the Bronze Age cataclysm persisted, like genetic ghosts hiding in the mountains, invisible to history but visible to 21st century gene sequencers. The Beaker people conquered Britain. They replaced Britain's men. They rewrote Britain's genetic code, but they couldn't erase Scotland's secrets. How did fragile Mesolithic DNA survive the most violent genetic reset in European history? The answer is hiding in Scotland's most mysterious people, a civilization that vanished so completely we can't even read their writing, but their blood never left. The Romans called them Picti, the Painted Ones, warriors who terrified legionnaires on Hadrian's Wall, people who carved elaborate symbols into standing stones, spirals, beasts, geometric patterns that look almost alien. We have no written Pictish language, no chronicles in their own words. When Kenneth MacAlpin unified the Pictish and Gaelic kingdoms in the 9th century, Pictish culture seemed to evaporate overnight. Their art, abandoned, their language, extinct, their symbols, undeciphered to this day, their identity, erased so thoroughly that for centuries, historians couldn't even agree on who they were. Victorian scholars imagined them as mysterious invaders from Scandinavia, from Scythia, even from lost Atlantis. But then came the DNA. Recent genetic studies pulling DNA from Pictish burial sites and comparing it to modern populations revealed something that overturned a century of speculation. The Picts weren't invaders. They were locals. Descendants of the very same people who'd been in Scotland for millennia. A genetic blend of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and Bronze Age Beaker settlers. The Picts were Scotland's original people, evolved over thousands of years in this landscape. And here's the revelation that changes everything. Highland Scots today still carry direct Pictish genetic signatures. DNA testing confirms unbroken continuity between ancient Pictish remains found in burial sites and modern populations in northern and eastern Scotland. The people didn't vanish, only their culture did. Think about this paradox. Really think about it. A civilization can be so thoroughly destroyed that we can't read a single sentence they wrote. Their language can go extinct. Their art can be abandoned. Their entire cultural identity can collapse into dust and be forgotten for 1,000 years. And yet their chromosomes persist, unbroken. It's as if someone burned every book in a library, destroyed every photograph, erased every memory, but left the DNA of the authors intact. How can blood outlive memory? How can genes survive when language, art, and identity shatter? The Picts prove something unsettling. Identity is more fragile than biology. Culture can die completely while DNA endures. But they also prove something else, something that makes Scotland unique. This landscape preserves what should be lost. And the preservation doesn't stop with ancient Europeans. Because some of the DNA showing up in Scotland shouldn't just be old. It shouldn't be here at all. Close your eyes and picture Scotland. Grey skies, cold rain, wind-swept islands where sheep outnumber people, remote glens shrouded in mist. The northwestern edge of Europe. Now picture the Sahara Desert. What if I told you those two places are genetically connected? In 2012, researchers at the University of Edinburgh published a study that made international headlines for all the wrong reasons. The findings were so unexpected that some accused the scientists of contamination, of errors in methodology, of impossible results. But the data held. Approximately 1% of Scottish people carry genetic markers specific to Saharan Berber populations. Not Mediterranean, not generic North African. Saharan, from desert-dwelling nomadic tribes, thousands of miles away from Scotland's rainy islands. DNA signatures from people who navigated sand dunes and blazing heat, showing up in populations that evolved in cold, wet, dark conditions. It makes no sense. And it gets stranger. Genetic analysis of Orkney populations, those tiny islands off Scotland's northern coast, reveals signals from the Yamnaya culture, Bronze Age steppe herders from the Pontic-Caspian region near the edge of Siberia. These genetic echoes date back roughly 5,000 years. Then there are the Roman traces. Faint but detectable markers from Spanish, Syrian, and North African soldiers who served on Hadrian's Wall. Some of their descendants clearly moved north, integrated into local populations, and left genetic fingerprints that persist today. Here's what makes this so profoundly strange. These aren't large population influxes. These are trace anomalies, genetic whispers that should have been diluted beyond detection after thousands of years of interbreeding and population mixing, but they're not. They're still there, still detectable, still unexplained. The studies documenting these markers are real, published, peer-reviewed, but the mechanisms, the actual routes of migration, the reasons for these genetic exchanges remain unclear. Scientists can see the DNA. They just can't explain how it got there. How does DNA from Saharan desert nomads end up on isolated islands at the edge of the world? How do genetic signals from Arctic steppes plant themselves in Scottish soil thousands of years ago and refuse to fade? The usual answer would be trade routes, occasional intermarriage, genetic drift. But those explanations require something Scotland supposedly didn't have: extensive long-distance contact with North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia. And even if that contact existed, why did Scotland preserve these traces while the rest of Europe didn't? It's as if Scotland isn't just isolated from the rest of Europe. It's connected to places it shouldn't be, while simultaneously disconnected from its neighbors. A genetic crossroads at the end of the world. And if you think that's the strangest preservation story in Scotland, wait until you hear about the Vikings. Late 700 CE, Norse raiders appear on the horizon. At first, they come for plunder monasteries, settlements, anything valuable they can carry back to Scandinavia. But then, they start staying, settling, colonizing Orkney and Shetland. Those remote archipelagos off Scotland's northern coast become Norse territories, not just politically, culturally, linguistically. For centuries, these islands were more Norse than Scottish. The local language shifted to Norn, a Norse dialect. The laws were Norse. The identity was Norse. But here's where the genetics reveal something that shouldn't be possible. Studies published in Nature analyzed Y chromosome data from Orkney and Shetland populations. What they found was staggering. Up to 60% of male Y DNA lineages in Orkney are of Norse origin. That's higher than most regions in Norway itself. Let that sink in for a moment. Orkney, a tiny, windswept archipelago, conquered and colonized by Vikings over 1,200 years ago, preserves Viking bloodlines more completely than the Viking homeland. This isn't just preservation. This is concentration. This is genetic amplification. Why? How does a colonized population end up genetically more Viking than the Vikings? Part of the answer is isolation. Orkney and Shetland became genetic islands within an island. Gene flow from mainland Scotland was limited by geography and culture. The Norse settlers intermarried within their communities, and those lineages persisted with unusual strength because there was nowhere else for the genes to go. But there's something deeper happening here. Something that repeats across Scotland's genetic landscape. Ancient genes don't just survive here, they amplify. Minority lineages that should fade into statistical noise become dominant markers. Trace ancestry that should be invisible becomes defining. It's as if Scotland isn't just a museum of extinct DNA. It's a place where the past refuses to become the past, where genetic echoes grow louder instead of fading. But there's one more illusion we need to shatter. One that goes to the heart of Scottish identity itself. The thing every tourist sees on shortbread tins and tartan scarves. The clans. How does DNA from Saharan desert nomads end up on isolated islands at the edge of the world? How do genetic signals from Arctic steppes plant themselves in Scottish soil thousands of years ago and refuse to fade? The usual answer would be trade routes, occasional intermarriage, genetic drift. But those explanations require something Scotland supposedly didn't have: extensive long-distance contact with North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia. And even if that contact existed, why did Scotland preserve these traces while the rest of Europe didn't? It's as if Scotland isn't just isolated from the rest of Europe. It's connected to places it shouldn't be, while simultaneously disconnected from its neighbors. A genetic crossroads at the end of the world. Ask anyone about Scotland, and they'll tell you about the clans. Campbell, MacDonald, MacLeod, Fraser, Stewart, blood families, brothers in arms, tribes bound by shared ancestry and ancient loyalty. Walk into any Scottish gift shop, and you'll see clan crests, tartans, family mottos. The entire tourist industry is built on this idea that Scottish identity is genetic, that the clans are bloodlines. Except they're not. Modern DNA testing has revealed one of the most uncomfortable truths in Scottish history. Most clans are not genetic lineages, they're brands. Take the MacDonalds, one of the most famous and powerful clan names in Scottish history. Lords of the Isles, warriors who defied kings. Genetic testing reveals multiple unrelated Y-DNA haplogroups within the MacDonald clan. These people don't share a common male ancestor. They don't descend from one founding father. They share a name. That's it. Here's how it actually worked. Clans functioned as military and political alliances. If you lived on MacDonald land, if you worked for a MacDonald lord, if you swore loyalty to the MacDonald chief in exchange for protection, you became a MacDonald. Blood didn't matter. Loyalty did. The clan system was feudal, not genetic. And here's where it gets fascinating. Some clans are true genetic dynasties. The Campbells, for example. DNA testing shows they trace back to a single founding Y chromosome lineage that expanded over centuries. Same with certain branches of the MacLeods. These are real patrilineal families that grew into powerful dynasties while maintaining genetic continuity. So Scottish identity is built on a paradox: names that mean everything and nothing, banners that unite strangers, bloodlines that are both real and imaginary at the same time. DNA has exposed something profound. For centuries, Scots have believed they know who they are based on surnames and tartans. But the genetic truth underneath is far stranger, older, and more complex than any clan mythology. The MacDonalds might not share blood with each other, but some of them share DNA with Pictish warriors from 1,500 years ago, with Norse raiders who burned monasteries, with Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who watched glaciers melt. Identity is a story we tell ourselves. DNA is the story we can't rewrite. And Scotland's DNA tells a story written in languages older than words. But why Scotland? Why here? What is it about this landscape that turns it into a genetic vault? Let's talk about geography. Scotland isn't just remote. It's fractured. The Highlands, split by mountains and glens that, for most of human history, were as impassable as ocean trenches. Islands separated by cold, dangerous seas. Terrain so rugged that villages 10 miles apart could go generations without intermarriage. These weren't just physical barriers. They were genetic barriers. The Hebrides, Islay, Lewis, Shetland, Orkney. Each became a self-contained genetic arc, isolated populations evolving independently for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. And when scientists began sequencing DNA from these populations, they found something extraordinary. Unique genetic markers that exist nowhere else in Europe. Not in Ireland, not in England, not in Scandinavia, not in continental Europe, only Scotland. In 2019, geneticist Jim Wilson at the University of Edinburgh published a landmark study that redrew Scotland's genetic map. His team analyzed thousands of samples and divided Scotland into 6 distinct genetic clusters, not based on culture, not based on language, but based purely on chromosomes. The most striking divide? A genetic line running northeast to southwest across the country, splitting Scotland nearly in half. This line doesn't follow modern political boundaries. It doesn't match linguistic patterns. It echoes the ancient border between the Picts and the Gaels. A political boundary from over 1,500 years ago, still visible in DNA today. Think about what that means. Kingdoms rise and fall. Languages die. Borders are erased and redrawn. Cultures blend and disappear. But the genetic map remains. Scotland's landscape didn't just isolate populations. It fossilized them. It turned them into living time capsules where ancient migration waves that swept across the rest of Europe and vanished, still echo in the blood of people alive today. The mountains acted like vault walls. The seas acted like moats. The islands became genetic freezers, preserving DNA that should have been diluted or replaced millennia ago. Scotland's geography created a genetic arc, and inside that arc, Scientists are finding bloodlines that evolution should have deleted thousands of years ago. But preservation comes with a cost, and some of those costs are written into the very traits that make Scots recognizable around the world, starting with one that's become a stereotype: fire in the blood. Red hair. Scotland has the highest prevalence of natural red hair anywhere on Earth. Approximately 13% of the Scottish population has red hair. Compare that to the global average of 1 to 2%. Why? The answer lies in a mutation in the MC1R gene, a genetic variant that affects melanin production. It's an adaptation for low sunlight. In Scotland's grey, overcast climate where UV exposure is minimal, this mutation allows more efficient synthesis of vitamin D from limited sunlight. But here's the catch. Red hair doesn't come alone. The same MC1R mutation that creates red hair also brings heightened sensitivity to pain, particularly thermal pain, increased risk of skin cancer due to reduced melanin protection, different responses to anesthesia, requiring higher doses in some cases, altered immune responses. The mutation that makes hair red also makes the nervous system respond differently to stimuli. It's a package deal. This is what happens when populations stay isolated for thousands of years. Traits that might be rare elsewhere concentrate, amplify, become defining characteristics. And it's not just red hair. Scotland has elevated rates of specific genetic variants linked to cystic fibrosis, particularly the Delta F508 mutation, hemochromatosis, iron overload disorder, certain forms of hereditary deafness, rare metabolic disorders. These aren't flaws. They're genetic echoes of ancient bottlenecks, moments in history when populations crashed to small numbers and random mutations got locked in. The same geographic isolation that preserved Scotland's ancient DNA also magnified certain traits to unusual levels. The vault that saved Ice Age genes also amplified red hair to world record frequencies, which raises an unsettling question. What other traits, physical, neurological, behavioral, are hiding in Scottish DNA, waiting to be discovered? What else concentrated here that we haven't identified yet? And what happens when those concentrated traits spread beyond Scotland's borders? Because that's exactly what happened. The story doesn't end in Scotland. Highland clearances, famine, economic collapse, political persecution over 3 centuries. Millions of Scots left their homeland. Today, over 30 million people worldwide claim Scottish ancestry, and thanks to modern genetic testing, we can trace diaspora lineages back to specific regions, sometimes specific islands. The genetic anomalies preserved in Scotland are now globally distributed. That 1% Saharan Berber ancestry, spread across 5 continents. Ice Age hunter-gatherer markers, in chromosomes of people in Vancouver who've never set foot in Europe. Viking DNA from Orkney, living in New Zealand, Australia, America. Scotland didn't just preserve genetic mysteries, it exported them. If you have Scottish ancestry even distant, there's a chance you're carrying DNA that science still can't fully explain. Markers that shouldn't exist, lineages that violate migration models. You could be walking around with genetic echoes from Ice Age hunter-gatherers, Bronze Age warriors, Pictish kingdoms, Viking raiders, Saharan nomads whose DNA traveled thousands of miles for reasons we don't understand. All mixed together in combinations that shouldn't be possible, and you'd never know until you tested. Scotland's DNA is a living paradox. Genes that survived extinction events when they should have vanished. Peoples who disappeared culturally but persist genetically. Foreign lineages appearing where they shouldn't, from Saharan deserts, Siberian steppes, Mediterranean shores, traits that concentrate beyond statistical expectation. Viking blood stronger in Orkney than Norway. Ice Age ancestry fossilized in Highland glens. Pictish DNA outliving Pictish culture by 1,000 years. Despite decades of genomic research, advanced sequencing, thousands of samples analyzed, we still don't have complete answers. We know what happened. We can see the genetic signatures clearly. We can trace timelines, map migrations, identify markers, but we don't fully understand why it happened here. Why did Ice Age DNA fossilize in Scotland and nowhere else? Why did the Bronze Age apocalypse leave survivors in these specific glens? Why does Viking blood run stronger in Orkney than the Viking homeland? Why do Saharan genetic markers show up on windswept Scottish islands? Why Scotland? The data is clear. The mystery remains. Maybe Scotland's fractured geography created a perfect storm of isolation and preservation, mountains and seas acting as genetic vault walls. Maybe ancient migration patterns were far more complex than we imagine, networks leaving no archaeological trace, only genetic whispers. Maybe there are entire chapters of human history we've lost, peoples who came and went, leaving nothing but DNA behind. Or maybe Scotland is trying to tell us something we're not ready to hear. That human history isn't a straight line. That populations don't move in predictable waves. That identity, culture, and blood are far more tangled and mysterious than we want to admit. That the past doesn't fade, it accumulates. The Picts left symbols we can't decipher, but their blood carries a message we're only beginning to read. And that message says, you are older than you think. The DNA in your cells remembers things your culture has forgotten, migrations your history books never recorded, encounters your ancestors couldn't explain. Scotland's landscape preserved these memories when the rest of Europe erased them. Until we can answer why these bloodlines survived here, and only here, the mystery of Scottish DNA remains unsolved. And if you have Scottish ancestry, you're not just watching a mystery, you're part of it. Are you ready to discover that you might be carrying DNA from people who shouldn't exist? Because science can read it now, but science still can't explain it. The mystery remains. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it should be. Thanks for watching.